Hello, I'm John Molesky, and this is Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Well, it's been 4 years since the military coup in Myanmar, and we want to take a look at what's happening in that nation now. And joining us is our man on that beat, Lucas Myers. He is Senior Associate for Southeast Asia with the Wilson Center's Indo-Pacific program. Lucas, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, John. Happy to be here.
So, February of 2021, the imprisonment of Aung San Suu Kyi and the takeover by the military. The Guardian had this headline just in the last week: the junta's brutality has failed to secure victory in the civil war, but is devastating the country. That's their compact take on the current situation. I'd like to hear from you on giving us a sense of what's happening.
So obviously, this is an incredibly complicated military conflict. It's been a much longer issue since just this 4 year period. I mean, this really does extend all the way back to independence. Fundamentally, Myanmar has been riven by a conflict between the minority ethnic groups and the majority Bamar, and the democracy struggle has been intertwined with this inter-ethnic issue as well. So it's a very complicated conflict, dozens of actors. But to keep it short and simple as much as possible, since the 2021 coup, the military has essentially failed to keep hold of the country. Their control has essentially weakened to probably less than 50% of the country's territory. And a coalition of a variety of ethnic armed groups and pro-democracy forces has clawed back a significant, level of the country, especially on the border regions, and really attempted to roll back this coup, and they've been remarkably successful. Now they have a long way to go, but I think this is something that we should all look to as an inspiring story of resistance.
So the less than 50%, I've seen estimates as low as 21%. What's happening in those parts of the country that are not under military rule?
So again, it's a highly complicated picture. You have some groups, some rebel groups that have been active since the 40s. I mean, these are really longstanding, entrenched. They're basically quasi-local governments with armed forces of their own in some cases. And then you have recent groups, often they're called People's Defense Forces, that sprung up after the 2021 coup. But this coalition, again, it's very broad, have fought their way against the military. Initially, it took some time. It was a slow start, guerrilla forces, hard scrabble, local people rising up against the military. But now they've organized significantly and really taken some territory, especially since late 2023. Now we're seeing cities fall to the resistance, including in places like Rakhine State, Shan State. These are areas along the border. And also you've seen the military really having to contract itself to the center of the country. It just doesn't have the manpower anymore to control this territory. That's why they say less than 50%. What they're really talking about is the military just being forced to give up its governance of large portions of the country.
How unified is the resistance in the sense that, you paint this very complex picture of different factions? Have they put aside their differences in order to resist the military coup? How unified is the group?
So this is a tricky question. So obviously there's been a long history of inter-ethnic conflict in Myanmar. Those issues remain. What's different about this iteration is the Bamar majority has now seized the military in the way that the ethnic minorities do as an oppressor. And they've really risen up. And this is why the military fundamentally is having such difficulty controlling the country, is this is a much wider resistance movement than we've seen in past struggles against military dictatorship in Myanmar's history. So I would say that there's a lot more unity. It's unprecedented in Myanmar's post-colonial history. However, that doesn't mean that it's simple or that there's some sort of catch-all answer. One big issue to keep an eye on is that there's not really an agreed upon political framework for after the military, or even really how to, there's no off-ramp right now of how do we get from, defeating the military on the battlefield to a post-war political settlement. That's not really been decided. And you can see some of these divisions within the rebel groups, emerging. Some, the Arakan army is a big one. They are clearly aiming for a quasi-independence. They have very little interest in democracy. But then there's other groups that are fighting for what they call a spring revolution, the idea that we're going to throw out the old constitution, we're going to remove the military from political power, and really forge a new, federal system in Myanmar that can accommodate these ethnic differences and rebuild democracy. But that divergence has not really been bridged yet.
Lucas, talk to us about the resources on both sides of this equation. How is the resistance having enough ammunition to keep resisting? And those types of factors, are there external players who are supporting either side?
Yeah, and again, this is further complexity. So right now, what I would say is the resistance initially started out with basically homemade weaponry in many cases. Some of the existing ethnic armed groups had their own military capabilities, kind of local production. Others actually got a lot of weaponry from China. This is where China's role is kind of complicated. China has attempted to exert leverage over basically all political factions in the country at various times. That includes arming some groups, especially the ones that are on their border. And then those groups sort of, filter weaponry to the other groups. Elsewhere, you get a lot of smuggling over the Thai border. Thai is a pretty active black market. And then other rebel groups just simply have captured weapons from surrendering junta soldiers. So it's a bit of a mixed picture, and this ammunition, supply issue has been a perennial problem, especially for the People's Defense Forces, the newer groups. The larger, long-standing ethnic groups have, their own capabilities, their own supply lines, but the newer groups have struggled with this. But again, I think the buildup has been slow, but now, as of 2025, even if just looking at combat footage, this is a far cry from 2021. Even the newer groups are looking like professional forces. They're well equipped. They have uniforms. They have weaponry.
The humanitarian costs are significantly high. Looking at some figures here, 4 million people displaced, half the population forced into poverty, less than half with access to electricity. The UN says Rakhine State is at imminent risk of acute famine. Is there any relief for the people who are suffering on the humanitarian side?
Unfortunately, no. So the military strategy at this point is punishment and retaliation. When they've lost towns and cities, they know they don't have the strategic reserves to retake these areas. Instead, what they've done is indiscriminately bomb them with their air force because they know the resistance lacks any sort of anti-air capability. They can't defend themselves. And so the military resorts to bombing civilian targets. They don't really even attempt to deploy these against strategic areas. They're hitting civilians, and they very much intend to do so. They've had this strategy they call four cuts, which essentially is just burning and pillaging areas that they've lost. It's quite brutal and horrible, and this is why the humanitarian situation is so dire.
Talk about international interest. Often it takes the at least support, if not the actual intervention from international forces to resolve situations like this. Does anyone care enough to expend resources on the situation in Myanmar?
So yeah, I'll paint the picture broadly. So right now, what's interesting is the US is by far the most significant backer of the pro-democracy forces. We've spent the most money, we've been the most supportive diplomatically. This is pretty accurate assessment. I think the US has been pretty committed on that front. However, by far the most influential actor here is China. China borders Myanmar. There are significant material interests at stake for Beijing. Rare earths, a huge actually percentage of Chinese rare earths are mined in Myanmar along the border regions. They also have a massive Belt and Road initiative, a series of projects, a big infrastructure route to the Indian Ocean that connects China to the Bay of Bengal. These are big interests that China has, and they've been active, especially the last 6 months or so. They invited the leader of the military junta to China in a big show of support. They've really come down hard to back him up. These are big shifts. And so China right now is trying to essentially assert their influence. They've picked the military as their guy to back, and they've recently really pushed in that direction. Other actors, of course, matter. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, has a role to play. However, they don't really have much leverage here. So countries like Thailand have, put their foot forward. But again, the big player here is China, I would say, and China is the key actor in all of this.
China has made noise about pressing for elections, which sounds absurd given the circumstances. Is there anything of merit to talk about there, or would that just be some dog and pony show that no one would really take seriously?
It's a fig leaf of legitimacy. So here's how Beijing sees this. They see the military situation pretty accurately. I mean, they understand the military is not performing well on any front. The economy is imploding. The battlefield situation looks really grim. So their solution is elections. So they've actually pushed the military in many cases to say, okay, you're going to hold an election in 2025 and you're going to call it an election. Everyone knows it's not a real election. The military will win whatever contest is had. It's not really a contest, right? But the idea here is that the military can then parade this around as this is our political off-ramp. There's a new government, maybe probably the same people from the military, just in new positions, right? And then the Chinese can back them up on this, go to the international community and say, hey, the military is reforming. They made peace. Look, the resistance forces are being obstinate. They're the problem. And then that's the Chinese approach. The military's approach now is sort of to use this to rehabilitate themselves at the world stage.
So the leadership, I want to ask you about. You talked about there is no clear off ramp. There is no plan after the win over the military junta, if that is in the cards. But among the resistance, are there voices, are there leaders who could potentially emerge? Usually it's going to take somebody to unify around if there's going to be any unification.
So that's the hard part. So the resistance forces will talk about this is a bottom-up revolution. We don't want a single leader. I mean, many of the ethnic groups would also say that in the past, the Bamar majority has really used their dominance, to harm ethnic interests. And so that's bad for them to have a too centralized system, right? That's they don't want that. They want a much more decentralized approach. That's why they say federalism is their, preferred solution to the overall crisis. That said, I think the leadership is a bit of an open question because you have really right now two big factions that I would, for simplicity's sake, point to. On the one hand, you have the pro-democracy forces. Now, the National Unity Government is the main, face of this umbrella group. They are the remnants of the parliamentarians of the former ruling National League for Democracy plus civil society actors. They've been the most active on the international stage. They're the ones who are meeting with American officials. They are sort of putting themselves forward as the face of this, the overall leadership of this movement. But then you have several longstanding ethnic armed groups like the Karen and the Kachin and the Chin who've worked with them recently and have a pretty similar set of goals. But then on the other hand, you have the Three Brotherhood Alliance. They are much closer to China. They are not very keen on democracy. If anything, they're quite authoritarian. There's been human rights violations, certainly in Rakhine State, committed by the Arakan army. These guys, they share a stance against the junta, but they're not necessarily fighting for democracy. And so that is a rift that could be a problem down the road, especially because China has a lot of leverage over those groups, who also are the best forces on the ground. Bar none, the Three Brotherhood Alliance are the most effective in combat. And so the resistance has a real dilemma here, where they need these Three Brotherhood Alliance, ethnic armies to fight alongside them, but there are some real political differences.
Lucas, I know you've been covering this story for a long time and you have deep knowledge. So I want to ask you, is there anything I haven't asked you about yet so far in our discussion that's really important for people to know?
I think one thing that often gets missed is it often gets broken down. So I would say that in DC, but just broadly, sort of the Western conversation, the media conversation on Myanmar, it's often humanitarian focused, or it's viewed as this, oh, it's another one of those long running civil wars that there'll be no end. I want to complicate that narrative quite a bit, actually. On one hand, I'll say this. This is a very unprecedented situation in Myanmar. This is totally different than the previous decades of conflict. The Bamar majority being on the side of the resistance is a big deal. The military's never been this weak. In the last 6 months, basically two of their military headquarters, the in Northeast and Western commands, surrendered to resistance forces. That's never happened in 75, 80 years of conflict. That's a big deal. So this is a once in a generation opportunity, really. And two, I would say that there actually is a lot of American interest here. And I'll point to why I think it's of a strategic interest. Beyond the human rights, beyond the democracy aspect, there are strategic interests at play. Number one, I would say Myanmar is really important for China. China actually is paying a lot of attention here. Xi Jinping personally is paying attention to this. Beijing is paying attention to this. Why? As I said before, it links China to the Indian Ocean. That's big. Right now, if you look at a map, a lot of Chinese trade, a lot of their oil imports, something like 80% of their imported oil flows through the Malacca Strait, which is Indonesia and Malaysia, right? That could be blockaded in a conflict over Taiwan by the United States Navy fairly easily. They want to bypass that issue, so they've been building this infrastructure route through Myanmar. To them, this is a vital geostrategic interest. That's why they're paying so much attention. That's why they're backing the military so heavily now. If we are in this great power competition with China, I think we have an interest here in seeing this opposed, right? And I think right now the resistance is the actor that would oppose this. And the military junta is essentially a puppet of the Chinese. This is something that the U.S. should pay attention to. Beyond that, Myanmar is a big country. It's 50 million or so people. They have a real, sense that this is their opportunity to change their lives. And I think if we were a part of this, it would be beneficial for us, not least in ASEAN. As long as this continues, ASEAN is incredibly weakened. Again, that allows Chinese influence in Southeast Asia. And three, Myanmar, again, is a huge source of rare earth minerals. There's a lot of strategic resources in the country. And, just ignoring it is not a viable solution. And I think relative to what it might, the expenditure here, I think we have a big opportunity to really shift the geostrategic playing board in Southeast Asia.
Is this is all fascinating, and I'm wondering, are there any voices in the U.S. policy community, whether in Congress or in the new administration, anywhere that are singing the same tune, that agree with the strategic importance that you just outlined?
I would say so, especially on the Hill. In Congress, there's a Burma caucus that's been, started up in the last couple years. They've been very active on this and talking about these issues and putting forth this policy agenda. I think right now the problem is fundamentally, it sounds trite and simple, but attention is a limited resource. And the U.S. government is very busy in the foreign policy space. I mean, you have active conflict in Ukraine, you have the Middle East. I mean, these are huge issues. You have the border crisis now. I mean, there's a lot to deal with. The National Security Council, frankly, just limited time, right? And so Myanmar tends to slip down that list of priorities. And what I'm saying and arguing for is that I think it probably needs a much higher prioritization, especially because if we're serious about this Indo-Pacific move, if we want to focus in the Indo-Pacific, this is one of the places where we will have to pay more attention.
Final thought, Lucas, on the sort of the optimism pessimism meter. You began by talking about how the resistance is inspiring, and you also said this is a generational, if not once in a lifetime opportunity potentially. Given those notions, are you optimistic about how this might play out?
Yes. So I think some analysts will say, oh, this is the year, this is the time. And I won't, obviously, we saw what happened in Syria just a few months ago. So, surprises happen all the time, right? But I think generally I stay optimistic, even if I don't think necessarily this is over in the next 6 months or 12 months, even. Because if the trend right now is the military is weakening. If you look at 2025 can then compare it to 2021, this is a whole nother picture. I mean, the military looks tremendously weak. And you move forward and you continue that trend line, I think you can see some real change. However, the one looming issue here is increased Chinese support for the military and sort of this election issue. If the military can pull off some sort of fig leaf, that could be a real death knell in the international space, especially if ASEAN just decides to accept it. And the U.S. is not able to really, lead the charge on backing up the pro-democracy resistance. These are some issues that I think need to be, thought about in DC and how we want to approach this. Maybe in the next 8, 9 months is probably the timeline when it's going to become critical.
Lucas Myers, thank you very much. You know, I really appreciate you keeping our eyes on the trend lines and not just getting completely distracted by the headlines. So good stuff. Thanks, Lucas.
Thank you, John.
We hope you enjoyed this edition of Wilson Center Now and that you'll join us again soon. Until then, for all of us at the center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for your time and interest.